Right. So last week we finished chapter 11. Today we are going to start chapter 10. But before we go into a verse by verse study on chapter 10, we need to first deal with the little book of Daniel, chapter 12, verse 4. Remember, Daniel was told to seal. So what did Daniel seal? What is the book that Daniel sealed? Okay, so we will start with that. Right. Now, a review of the chiastic structure of Daniel 1 to 7 reveals that the book of Daniel is actually composed of two books, right? That is two books in one book, the one book of Daniel. The first book embraces chapters 1 to 7, and the second book is Daniel chapter 8 to 12. Now, I put up the structure of the first book, Daniel chapter 1 to 7 on the slide there. So chapter 1, and then I have given you a small diagram there of the structure. So right at the top of the candelabrum, you have Daniel 1. Now Daniel 1 is the introduction. That's the introduction to the entire book of Daniel, right? Then we notice that on the same branch below, now you get this center. This is the center one, and then you get the other branches, right? So then below, you get Daniel 2. On one side, you get Daniel 2, and on the other side, you get Daniel 7, right? So those are what is called chain prophecies. Those are what we call chain prophecies, right? The reason why they're on the same branch is because their theme is the same. They have the same theme. Daniel chapter 2, you have the 4 metals. And in Daniel chapter 7, you have the 4 beasts, right? They are chain prophecies. That's why they're on the same branch of this candlestick. Then Daniel chapter 3 and Daniel chapter 6 are closely related. They're on the next branch. They're closely related because in both of them, there are stories that are very similar. Now, in Daniel chapter 3, we have the 3 young men that are thrown into the fiery furnace because they refuse to practice false religion, right? So they refuse to practice false religion. Then in Daniel chapter 6, we have Daniel thrown into the lion's den because he insisted on worshiping God according to the dictates of his conscience. So there is this conflict between God's law and worship to God. Then we have, in the last one, we have Daniel chapters 4 and 5. Those two have a common theme as well, because in Daniel chapter 4, you have the fall of Nebuchadnezzar for being arrogant, right? The king of Babylon. Now, actually, pride is one of the worst sins in the Bible. That's a different study altogether. So we find that Nebuchadnezzar was so arrogant and proud. And then you find in Daniel chapter 5, you have the definitive fall of Belshazzar for his arrogance as well. So those two are closely linked. So we find that the first half of Daniel, or the first book of Daniel, is self-contained, right? It's the historical part of the book of Daniel. Right, now let's quickly review it once more. The first book of Daniel, you get the lion, which is Babylon, 605 to 339. Remember, BC is coming down, so it becomes less than becoming more. That is found in Daniel 7. I had given all the information there. Then you get the bear, the Medes and the Persians, 539 to 331 BC. Then you get the leopard, Greece, 331 to 168 BC. And then you get the dragon. The dragon is the Roman Empire, 168 BC to 476 AD, right? Then you get the pagan Roman Empire dividing. It's divided into 10 horns. That was carved out by the barbarians who destroyed the Roman Empire. Then from the 10 horns, uprooting 3, comes the little horn, right? The papal Rome during the 1260 years, which began from AD 538 till 1798 AD. So that's a quick review. Then we have something that is very seldom addressed in evangelism or in most places, And that is that the deadly wound, or after the papacy ends its period of dominion, you have in Daniel 7 the judgment. And we're going to notice that the judgment has 3 stages. The book of Daniel presents the judgment in 3 stages, just like what happens in a court of law, even in our country today, right? So the first stage is the judgment, or the first stage of the judgment is the investigation. Then the second is the verdict, based on the investigation and what the prosecution presents and the defense, and what finally is the outcome, a verdict is given. And then the third is the execution of the verdict or the reward, right? Now in Daniel 7, no precise date is given, but the process will begin, we are told, after 1798, when the little horn receives its deadly wound. Now, first of all, you have the investigative judgment of evidence. Secondly, based on evidence, you have the verdict, like I said. And third, the giving of the judgment or executing that was utterly based on the investigation. So the verdict is totally based on the investigation. Now, in consequence of the judgment, because of the judgment, Christ and his saints will possess the kingdoms of the world. Daniel 7:14 tells us that, right? 14, 22, 26, and 27. Note the consequence of powers indicates that the judgment would begin sometime after 1798. Why? Well, because the little horn ruled in 1798. And then the next point in the prophecy is the judgment. Right? So once the little horn has finished its ruling, when it receives its deadly wound, only the judgment begins, right? And the judgment would conclude with Christ receiving the kingdom from his Father. Now, no one before October 23, 1844, October 23, 1844, understood that the judgment would happen in 3 stages. That is the investigation in heaven, sentencing in heaven, the rewarding on earth. They didn't understand that, right? But before October, they couldn't understand it. Why? Because the little book was open only after 1798, right? So the little book had to be open. They had to understand it for them to see. So before October 23, 1844, no one understood that, because that was going to be understood when the little book was open in the time of the end. And the time of the end says, the first angel says, for the judgment of God has begun. So until the judgment of God began, nobody would understand it, right? The little book had to open when the judgment of God began, right? We will go into that a little bit more later on. Now, Daniel chapter 7, which is an amplification of Daniel chapter 2. Daniel chapter 2 is the foundation prophecy. Daniel chapter 7 runs in 4 repetitive cycles. Now, we have spoken about this before. The Bible runs in repetitive cycles, and then it will take you forward, and then it will take you backwards to explain. That is why you and I are in the middle of this chapter 11 and 10, because after the 5th trumpet, there is this explanation given in the Bible as to what is happening. It's explaining further the French Revolution, which was the 5th trumpet, and what was taking place after that. That is why we have this interlude between the trumpets, right? So we have this in Daniel chapter 7 running in 4 repetitive cycles. The first cycle is Daniel chapter 7 verses 9 and 10. Then you get verses 13 and 14, another cycle. Then verses 17 and 18 is further cycle. 21 and 22, another cycle. And 25 to 27 is another cycle, right? So that is the cycles that are given. Now let's look at these 4 repetitive cycles of Daniel 7, right? And please note that the explanations in the verses have been given within brackets. Those are not part of the Bible text, but they're explanations, right? So let's read Daniel 7, 9, and 10.
I watched till thrones were put in place, and the Ancient of Days in heaven was seated. His garment was white as snow, and the hair of his head was like pure wool. His throne was a fiery flame, its wheels a burning fire. A fiery stream issued and came forth from before him. 1,000 thousands ministered to him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him in heaven. The court was seated in heaven, and the books were opened. The investigation.
Now, if you read this chapter carefully, the Ancient of Days is God the Father. God the Father was not where he was when this begins. So he comes, right? And all this is taking place in heaven, not on earth. This is taking place in heaven, right? And so this means that the Ancient of Days, God the Father, was not seated here where the judgment is taking place before the judgment began. And we know that the judgment began on October 22nd, 1844. Then the 10,000 times thousands and thousands represent the angels, right, in heaven. Now, verse 13 is a same continuation of this same scene. Let's read 13 and 14.
I was watching in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. He came to the Ancient of Days in heaven, and they brought him near before him, before the Father in heaven. Then to him, to Jesus, was given by the Father in heaven dominion and glory and a kingdom. Clearly, Jesus receives the kingdom in heaven before the second coming, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom the one which shall not be destroyed.
Okay, so we know the Son of Man is referring to Jesus, right? And who brings Jesus to where the Father is? So Jesus is not here before. Jesus is brought there by the angels. So what does Jesus do? Jesus goes to the Father to receive his kingdom, right? The sentence to receive the kingdom is given in heaven because Jesus receives the kingdom in heaven. And what is Jesus's kingdom? Jesus's kingdom comprises of his faithful people that the judgment has found faithful and whose names are retained in the book of life. That comprises Jesus's kingdom, right? So that is why there has to be an investigative judgment to decide who is fit to be part of Jesus's kingdom, right? So now comes the interpretation of the vision of Daniel 7, right? The vision is from verses 1 to 14, and then come 3 cycles that add explanations. Daniel wants to know what these beasts represent and what the kingdom is all about. So in verses 17, the angel comes back and says to him this. So we find that the vision was given by Daniel and by Gabriel, and Daniel couldn't understand. Daniel was asking what it is. So the angel Gabriel comes back to explain it. So let's read Daniel 7, 17 and 18.
Those great beasts, which are 4 and 4 kings, which arise out of the earth, but the saints of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom, the execution of the sentence forever, even forever and ever.
Okay, so that is a very short explanation that Gabriel gives about the 4 beasts. He says they are 4 kings or kingdoms, and possess the kingdom means the execution of the sentence. So those who are found, whose names are found retained in the book of life, possess the kingdom. They become part of the kingdom. So once again, we find Daniel is not satisfied. He says, I need to know more, especially about the 4th beast, right? And the judgment scene. So then in verses 21 and 22, we find these words. So the angel goes back to talk about the same little horn. Can you see the cycle? So he first explains it, Daniel is not happy, so then begins another cycle. Let's read verse 21 and 22.
I was watching, and the same horn was making war against the saints and prevailing against them until the Ancient of Days came. And a judgment was made in favor of the saints in heaven, of the Most High in heaven. And the time came at the second coming for the saints to possess the kingdom when Jesus comes.
Okay, so what period is this talking about? Then Gabriel comes and he gives a further explanation. This period or date in history is from 538 AD to 1798 AD, when the papacy was in full dominion, right? And that was the fourth trumpet. Remember, we are still in the trumpets. We are taking a break to, there is an interlude to explain things a little better, right? So we find here that the angel amplifies what he said before, right? He's giving more information. He tells Daniel that a verdict is given in heaven, but implemented only when Jesus comes. So the verdict is given in heaven, but it's implemented when Jesus comes. So the three stages of investigation, once again, you get judgment, you find investigation, verdict, implementation of the verdict, become very clear in verses 21 and 22. But still, Daniel wants to know more. So then in verse 25 to 27, Gabriel once again goes back to talk about, this time, about the little horn. So you find the first cycle, Daniel didn't understand quite much. Then the second cycle gives a little bit more information, right? Now Daniel wants to know about the little horn. So let's read verses 25 to 27.
He, the little horn, shall speak pompous words against the Most High, shall persecute the saints of the Most High, and shall intend to change times and law. Then the saints shall be given into his hand for a time and times and half a time. But the court shall be seated for the investigation, and they shall take away his dominion in heaven to consume and destroy it forever. Then the kingdom and dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people on earth, the saints of the Most High. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and all dominion shall serve and obey Jesus.
Okay, so now is this explanation is a bit clearer now, right? This we quite clearly see could not be understood until until October 23rd, 1844. The Millerites didn't understand it, and that is why they were greatly disappointed, because they didn't quite understand this. Now the summary once again of the three stages of the judgment in Daniel 7. The judgment sits, God opens the books in heaven, the records of all those who have professed the name of Jesus are examined. Then the investigation ends. God will pronounce the sentence in favor of the saints in heaven, and the Father will give Jesus Christ the kingdom. Now, when all of the cases are examined, and it's shown who is truly a member of his kingdom, then probation closes, and Jesus comes to give the kingdom to his people. Then the time will come when Jesus and his subjects will empirically possess the kingdom, right? So that is the stages of the judgment. Is that clear?
Yes.
Okay, now Mrs. White is in full harmony with the Bible, and she understood that when the investigative judgment is over, the kingdom of Jesus is complete. So let's read early writings, page 280.
Every case had been decided for life or death. While Jesus had been ministering in the sanctuary, the investigative judgment had been going on for the righteous dead, and then for the righteous living. Christ has received his kingdom, having made the atonement for his people and blotted out their sins. The subjects of the kingdom were made up. The marriage of the Lamb was consummated. The kingdom and the greatness of the kingdom under the whole heaven was given to Jesus and the heirs of salvation. And Jesus was to reign as King of Kings, Lord of Lords.
Okay. So Mrs. White is in full harmony. Mrs. White can't be not in harmony because it's the same spirit that inspired the Bible that inspired her, right? So I don't know why people think that different. Okay. Now, when does the judgment begin? The judgment begins with Adam. And then we know, as we have studied, then it moves on to the righteous living. This is at the end of time, and that will be the sealing of the 144,000, the living saints. Jesus marries the totality of his people, right? But remember, it's the individual who receives Jesus, who is truly a child of God, who is invited to the marriage, right? It's the corporate totality is saved. So the entire, all the faithful of God make up his kingdom, and they are the bride. But the individuals are the ones who are invited to the wedding. Now, it's a strange way of thinking, but that's the way it is, right? So those who are invited to the wedding make up the totality, right? Remember, that is why the one who was not wearing the wedding garment was asked by the father, what are you doing there? Right? So they had to, the right for them to be there at the wedding was the wedding garment, right? So, but the totality, the bride, the kingdom of Jesus is the corporate, the entire body, but individuals are the ones who are invited to the wedding. Now, taking the kingdom and marrying his kingdom is the same thing, right? Jesus takes his kingdom or marries his kingdom. It's the same thing, just two different ways of saying the same thing. Daniel 7 says that the kingdom is given to Jesus and to his heirs. Now, an illustration of what happens during the investigative judgment, just so that we understand it. Now, imagine if you can, right, go with me in time to when the case of John Huss, who was a martyr during the 1260 years. Now, when the case of John Huss comes up before the heavenly court, just imagine. We don't know when that was or is, we don't know. It's in chronological order according to when a person lived, right? So was the earthly judgment against John Huss? It was a travesty of justice, right? John Huss was declared a heretic and he was burnt at the stake, right? He was innocent, and yet the innocent died, and those who were guilty lived, right? The ones who accused him lived. How much justice is there in that? None at all, right? Now, does God have to rectify or adjust that? God has to rectify that, so that when the case of the earthly, when the earthly court pronounced a wrong judgment against Huss and killed him, the little horn prevailed, right? It went well for him, for the little horn, but the righteous Huss died and the unrighteous lived. So there was a travesty of justice. It wasn't fair, right? Now let's dramatize the judgment seat a bit, right? But in the judgment in heaven, God says, John Huss, present yourself before my judgment seat. And so an angel brings John Huss's DVD, his books where every bit of his life was written on it, right? The record of his life. And the heavenly courts examine the record of his life. As it's examined, the heavenly jury is aghast. And the heavenly jury says, something is wrong here. John Huss gave his life to Jesus. He was faithful, and yet a wrong judgment was given on earth. We need to rectify that. So a judgment is pronounced in favor of John Huss in heaven. Okay? Now, what is the focus of Daniel 7? Is it upon the little horn, the persecution of the little horn, or is its focus on rectifying the earthly judgments that the little horn did, so that God's people can eventually be saved in the kingdom? Do you know that no, do you know that it is wrong to say that the center of Daniel 7 is a little horn or the saints receiving the kingdom? Because in order for the saints that were trampled by the little horn to receive the kingdom, it is necessary for the heavenly courts to rectify the situation. So Daniel chapter 7, the focus is on the heavenly courts rectifying the wrong judgments given on earth to God's people, right? I hope this makes sense because this is fundamental. It is one of our Adventist fundamental doctrines that what the earthly courts did during the 1260. That is why when we studied the seals, Jesus says, wait a little while, right? Till the numbers, because they cry, how long, oh Lord, how long? So in the judgment, they will be vindicated and the correct verdict will be given. So that is what Daniel 7 is talking about here. Okay. So now let's move on to the second book. Now the second book in book of Daniel is chapters 8 through 12. Daniel 7 is a self-contained book, right? We saw that. Why? Because it has everything in chiastic order. But the second book is the book that is mentioned in Daniel 12:4. And that is the book that the angel told Daniel to seal till the end of time. Now we are going to understand why that is clearly a little bit, right? Now let's read Daniel 12:4, where the angel tells Daniel to shut up the words.
But you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase.
Okay, question. Was the book sealed forever? No, that verse is very clear. The book would be sealed in the times of Daniel, and it would be open in the time of the end. So what is the time of the end? 1798. So after 1798, we could very well find that the book is open. We will find that out, where it is open and where that is mentioned. Now, does that mean, now when it says knowledge shall increase, now I have heard many pastors from our pulpits explaining it that knowledge increases means that science and technology, airplanes and automobiles, locomotives and nuclear weapons and electric toothbrushes are the ones that knowledge is. No, that is not what the Bible is saying, right? That is not what it's saying. What this verse is saying is, if you read the verse in context, it is saying that knowledge will increase, not in technology, the knowledge will increase in the little book, because a little book has been opened. Daniel is told to shut it up. It will be opened at the end of time. When it opens at the end of time, people will run to and fro, means they will get more information. They will understand better what was shut up in Daniel, and their knowledge of that will increase, right? So this is much more powerful when we show people that this is exactly what happened leading up to 1844, because the end of time was 1798, right? So beginning in the 1800s, the Millerites began to get information because the book was open, right? And people were interested in Daniel 8 and 12, which is the second book of Daniel. Now, Amos 8, 11 and 12 uses the same Hebrew idiom for moving to and fro, right? That Daniel used in Daniel chapter 12, verse 4, right? Let's read Amos 8, verses 11 and 12.
Behold, the days are coming, says the Lord God, that I will send a famine on the land, not a famine of bread, nor a thirst for water, but of hearing the words of the Lord. They shall wander from sea to sea, and from north to east. They shall run to and fro, seeking the word of the Lord, but shall not find it.
Now that is talking about after probation closes, people will try to find, but they'll not find it because there is no reason for them to be found because probation has closed, right? But listen carefully. So that is what the book is. Amos is this running to and fro means they will be searching for knowledge of these prophecies and not find it, right? But Daniel chapter 12 verse 4 says that at the end of time, people will search for the knowledge, they will find the knowledge, right, about these books. Now listen carefully. The book of Daniel, the book that Daniel sealed until the end of time, which we find in Daniel chapter 12 verse 4 and 9, is not the entire book of Daniel. Okay, it's not the entire book of Daniel, not even all of Daniel 8 through 12, right? It's not even Daniel 8 through 12, not all of it, but rather the portion or part whose central theme is the 2300 days or year prophecy, right? And the beginning of the date for the heavenly investigative judgment. And that could not be understood until after October 22nd, 1844, right? So the book that was sealed by Daniel is not the entire book, but the portion or the part which has the central theme of the 2300 days or year prophecy, right? Now, where do we get this proof from? How do we know that this is correct? The Bible says in the voice of one or in the voice of three witnesses that you can find truth, right? You have to have 2 or 3 witnesses. So we know that at least there are 5 reasons why we believe that the portion that was sealed, the book that was sealed in Daniel refers to the 2300 day prophecy and the investigative judgment for these reasons, right? The second book of Daniel was closed and sealed in the days of the prophet, right? And it was to be opened in the end of time, that is after 1798. Now, this verse has nothing to do, like I said, to increase science and technology. When God removes the seal from this book that was sealed, that he asked Daniel to seal, at the end of time, people will run to and fro, seeking an increased knowledge of the contents of this book. This is the way that Mrs. White invariably understood the expression, knowledge shall be increased. So if anyone gets up and tells you knowledge is about rockets going to the moon or rocket science or anything, that is not what the Bible is talking about. The Bible is talking about understanding, increasing their knowledge of the portion, the book that was sealed in Daniel. Now there are 5 reasons. Let's go to reason number 1. The book of Daniel contains 2 different languages. Do you know that? Chapter 1, which is the introduction to the entire book, is in Hebrew. It is written in Hebrew. Then chapters 2 to 7 are in Aramaic, right? Then chapters 8 to 12 are in Hebrew, right? The difference in language between Daniel 2 and 7 and Daniel 8 and 12 strongly hints that the book is composed of 2 distinctive units. Now, does that seem to mark a distinction between the first half of the book and the second half of the book? The change of language? Absolutely, right? The first introduction is for the entire book. Okay, that's in Hebrew. Then 2 to 7 is in Aramaic and 8 to 12 is in Hebrew. So clearly telling us that Daniel, the book of Daniel has 2 books in it. So that is reason number 1. Now, reason number 2, right? Now, there is clear evidence that most of Daniel chapter 1 to 7, with the exception of the judgment scene in Daniel 7, was understood long before the time of the end. The church father, Hippolytus, who wrote in the 3rd century AD, understood the sequences of power in Daniel chapter 7. So Daniel chapters 1 to 2 were understood before. We'll read quotations so that we can understand that better. So was Daniel 7 in its totality sealed until the end of time? No. Hippolytus in the 3rd century understood it, just like us Adventists. So let's read what he has to say about it, right? In the book, The Prophetic Faith of Our Fathers, Volume 1, page 272. Let's read that quotation.
In speaking of a lioness from the sea, Daniel meant the rising of the kingdom of Babylon, and that this was the golden head of the image. Then after the lioness, he sees a second beast, like a bear, which signified the Persians. For after the Babylonians, the Persians obtained the power, and in saying that it had 3 ribs in its mouth, he pointed to the 3 nations, Persians, Medes, and Babylonians, which were expressed in the image by the silver after the gold. Then comes the third beast, a leopard, which means the Greeks. For after the Persians, Alexander of Macedon had the power when Darius was overthrown, which was also indicated by the brass in the image. And in saying that the beast had 4 wings of a fowl and 4 heads, he showed most clearly how the kingdom of Alexander was parted into 4 divisions. For in speaking of 4 heads, he meant the 4 kings that arose out of it. For Alexander, when dying, divided his kingdom into 4 parts. Then he says, the 4th beast was dreadful and terrible. It had iron teeth and claws of brass. Who then are meant by this but the Romans, whose kingdom, the kingdom that still stands, is expressed by the iron? For says he, its legs are of iron.
Okay, so did he understand it? He understands it's quite like us, right? He understands the 4 beasts of Daniel chapter 7. So that is not sealed, right? Till the end of time, because he is in the third century, 300. So when the Romans are still in control. So he understood it, right? Hippolytus, he understood. So it wasn't a sealed book. Daniel 7 wasn't sealed. It was understood by people, but because the end of time is 1798. So before that, they understood. Let's read another one from him. Did Hippolytus also understand the meaning of the 10 horns and the little horn? Let's see what he says in the next quotation.
Let us look at what is before us more carefully and scan it, as it were, with open eye. The golden head of the image is identical with the lioness by which the Babylonians were represented. The golden shoulders and arms of silver are the same with the bear, by which the Persians and Medes are meant. The belly and thighs of brass are the leopard, by which the Greeks who rule from Alexander onwards are intended. The legs of iron are the dreadful and terrible beast, by which the Romans who hold the empire now are meant. The toes of clay and iron are the 10 horns, which are to be. The one other little horn springing up in their midst is the Antichrist. The stone that smites the image and breaks it in pieces, and that filled the whole earth, is Christ, who comes from heaven. Notice that he did not understand that there was going to be a heavenly pre-advent investigative judgment and brings judgment on the world.
Okay, so the only thing that he didn't understand was that the judgment is in heaven, right? He understood that there was going to be a judgment before Jesus came to this world, right? He understood everything in Daniel 7. But is it correct to say that Jesus comes to earth to judge? No, that is not what the text says. So he didn't understand that. He didn't understand that the judgment takes place in heaven, right? So except that the judgment was in heaven, he clearly understood Daniel chapter 7. Now, the evidence from these quotations indicate that Hippolytus understood everything about Daniel except one vitally important detail, the investigative pre-advent judgment in heaven, right? That takes place before the second coming. According to the understanding, his understanding, the judgment to take place when Jesus comes from heaven to earth, right? To judge the world and establish his eternal kingdom. However, as we have already noted from scripture, from the passages of scripture, the investigative judgment and the verdict take place in heaven before Jesus returns to the earth. Now, is that what the Millerites believed before October 22, 1844? Absolutely. They thought Jesus was coming and the judgment was happening on earth, right? We should note that people could understand some portions of Daniel that found their fulfillment before the end of time. The historical sections of chapters 1 and 3 were easy to understand. Chapter 1, could they understand the great image, right? That is found in Daniel 2? They could understand. Could they understand the 3 young men that were thrown into the fiery furnace? Yes, they could understand that. That wasn't sealed. Could they understand the case of Nebuchadnezzar going insane for 7 years? Yes, right? It happened. Could they understand the fall of Babylon and Belshazzar? Yes. Could they understand Daniel being thrown into the lion's den? Yes. And could the majority of Daniel chapter 7, with the exception of the investigative judgment in heaven, be understood? Yes. Now, Daniel chapter 8 explain the meaning of the ram and the he-goat long before the time of the end. Remember, it gave the explanation of the ram and the he-goat. So could people understand the ram and the he-goat of Daniel chapter 8? Yes, sure. You know, we don't need to be rocket scientists to know that. The ram represents the Medes and the Persians, and the he-goat represents Greece. And the notable horn was Alexander, the first king, and the 4 horns represent the divisions of the kingdom of the first king. So that could be understood, right? It is given also in scripture. Now, the prophecy of the 70 weeks was also not a mystery. It took place when Jesus was here on earth. It was fulfilled there. So could the people understand the 70 weeks before October 22, 1844? Yes. Many people understood the 70 weeks because it had already been fulfilled in Christ. So people understood many of the early portions of Daniel 11 also, right? Before the time of the end, right? Now, the pagan philosopher Porphyry entertained the discussion with the church father Tertullian, arguing that the earlier portions of Daniel 8 describe so precisely the Greek and the early Roman history that it could not have been written in the 6th century BC by Daniel, right? But rather by an anonymous writer in the 2nd century after it had taken place, because it was so precisely written, right? Because the details about the history of Rome and Greece were so precise that nobody could have predicted it beforehand. That is what he thought, right? Now, there is just one thing that could not be understood in all of this, and that is that there would be an investigative judgment in heaven before the coming of Jesus. A judgment for Jesus to examine the cases of all those who professed his name, to establish his kingdom, the members of his kingdom, and then he could give the kingdom to those people who were found faithful, right? However, the time element relating to the heavenly pre-advent judgment remained sealed until the time of the end. God commanded Daniel to seal the message concerning the 2,300 days or years and the heavenly pre-advent judgment until the time of the end, because only then could it be true that the hour of God's judgment had arrived. Because when you see, according to the chain prophecies, after the 1,260 years only, the hour of God's judgment comes. So before that, people couldn't understand. So the first angel's message couldn't go out. The hour of God's judgment has arrived. It couldn't go out before 1798. So those are the parts that the little book that was sealed, that is sealed in Daniel 12, 4 and 9 is about. Is that clear? Okay, hope so. Now, the third reason why we say that this or part most of Daniel could be understood is Mrs. White explicitly states repeatedly in her writings that the book that Daniel sealed until the time of the end was not the totality of the book of Daniel, not the entire book, but rather the portion or part of the book that has to do with the date for the beginning of the judgment as depicted in the 2300 day prophecy. Now, following are some of her comments. So let's read. The first one is found in Acts of the Apostle, page 585.
In the Revelation, all the books of the Bible meet and end. Here is the complement of the book of Daniel. One is a prophecy, the other revelation. The book that was sealed is not the revelation, but that portion of the prophecy of Daniel relating to the last days. The angel commanded, but thou, O Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book even to the time of the end.
Okay, so she understands it clearly. What is it that is sealed? A portion of the book having to do with last day events, right? End time events. Okay, let's go to another quotation from us found in the Great Controversy, page 355.
Of all ages. The message of salvation has been preached in all ages, but this message is a part of the gospel which could be proclaimed only in the last days. For only then would it be true that the hour of judgment had come. The prophecies present a succession of events leading down to the opening of the judgment. The fulfillment of Daniel 7 and 8 begins in the days of the prophet and continue in succession until the judgment. This is especially true of the book of Daniel. However, that part of his prophecy that related to the last days, Daniel was bidden to close up and seal to the time of the end. Not till we reach this time could a message concerning the judgment be proclaimed based on the fulfillment of these prophecies. However, at the time of the end, says the prophet, many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased.
Okay, here she is referring to the first angel's message. The hour of his judgment has come. So that is the portion that was sealed. So the first angel's message could not be preached, right? Because before 1798, because before the hour of his before that, the hour of God's judgment had not come, right? For only then, when the hour of God's judgment had come, could it be true that the hour of judgment had come and that could be proclaimed. Okay, is that clear? Now let's go to the next quotation. It is from Manuscript Releases, Volume 1, page 99.
The unsealing of the little book was the message in relation to time, the 2300 days.
Okay, so clear, right? Clearly the part that is sealed has to do with the 1200 day prophecy. Okay, next quotation is from Prophets and Kings, page 547.
Honored by the men with the responsibilities of state and with the secrets of kingdoms bearing universal sway, Daniel was honored by God as his ambassador and was given many revelations of the mysteries of ages to come. His wonderful prophecies, as recorded by him in chapters 7 to 12 of the book bearing his name, were not fully understood even by the prophet himself. But before his life labors closed, he was given the blessed assurance that at the end of the days, in the closing period of this world's history, he would again be permitted to stand in his lot and place, not in person, but through the unsealing of his book. It was not given him to understand all that God had revealed of the divine purpose. shut up the words, and seal the book. He was directed concerning his prophetic writings. These were to be sealed even to the time of end. Go thy way, Daniel. The angel once more directed the faithful messenger of Jehovah, for the words are closed up and sealed till the end of till the time of the end. Go thou thy way till the end, NB, for thou shalt rest and stand in thy lot at the end of days.
Okay, so what is the aspect that was not understood particularly by Daniel? It was the event that had to do with the time prophecy of the 2300 days. Okay, now reason 4. Internal evidence found in Daniel 8 to 12 proves beyond any doubt that these chapters compose the little book sealed until the end of time of the end. When you examine these chapters, you find that these chapters have a central theme and that binds them together. That is the 2300 days and the beginning date for the heavenly investigative judgment. Now let us consider the content of these pages one by one and see how they relate to the 2300 days and the heavenly judgment. Let's go through the chapters. Let's start in Daniel 8. Now, the vision in this chapter describes the historical chain of events that precede the beginning of the investigative judgment. That happens before the investigative judgment happens. So you find the ram with the 2 horns, right? The vision begins in Medo-Persia during the Medo-Persian kingdom. The he-goat is the kingdom of Greece. The notable horn on the head is the he-goat, the first king of the Grecian Empire, Alexander the Great. The 4 horns, as we know, come out on the head of this goat, scapegoat, after the great horn was broken. The 4 divisions of the Grecian Empire, that were the 4 divisions of the Grecian Empire after Alexander's death. And then from the 4 divisions, the little horn, right? The secular Rome extended, remember we studied that 2 weeks ago or last week, horizontally, geographically, on the earth towards the south, east, and the glorious land that is Palestine. And then the little horn morphs, it becomes the papacy, morphs means it becomes the papacy, into a power that grows vertically to heaven, persecuting the saints on earth and interfering with the work of Jesus in the heavenly sanctuary, right? That's what 8 is saying. Daniel 8, the vision itself ends with 2 heavenly messengers speaking, and 1 heavenly messenger asks, until when will this vision be? So that is the totality of the vision. And what is the answer? Then the 2300 days, at the end of which the sanctuary will be cleansed. That is found in Daniel 8, verse 14. Now, I want you to notice something very important. Here, the vision covers the question, until when? So they're asking, until when will this vision be? Until when? Right? Remember that clearly. The vision of Daniel covers the period from the ram until the end of the 2300 days. When the ending point arrived, the process of cleansing of the sanctuary would begin. Okay? Now it covers the entire vision given in Daniel chapter 8. Then the interesting thing is that Daniel comes and he tries to explain to Daniel particularly the time element of this prophecy. But Daniel just can't get it. So the chapter ends by saying, Daniel saying, I don't understand. But do you know what he didn't understand? There are 2 words for vision in Daniel 8. Unless you're able to go to Hebrew, to the root of Hebrew, you will never know that there are 2 words, right? The first word is Shezon, right? Now, Shezon, I have given you on the screen, I have given you a small chart there that will help you understand. Shezon, which is a vision, right? Shezon, but the Greek word is Shezon, which is an indicator that Shezon describes the entire vision from the Medo-Persian from the Medo-Persian kingdom. Where did I stop? From the Medo-Persians right to the time till the cleansing of the sanctuary. Okay, so that is this Shezon. Now the second word is Mare, right? And Mare, the word Mare applies to only the 2,300 days in this vision, of this vision, right? It is specialized to that particular point. So Shezon, as you can see, I have given you in the red, that is the full vision. But the Mare is the 2,300 day prophecy. Now, Daniel then gets sick and Gabriel was not able to finish the explanation. Did Gabriel give an explanation of the Mare? No, he couldn't because Daniel got sick. The problem is that the Daniel 8 provides us with the length of the time, 2,300 years, the time period. But it does not provide us with the starting point for the 2,300 year prophecy. So we have no way of knowing that when the prophecy begins for us to understand when it ends. So Daniel is confused. Why? Because God had said that Israel was going into captivity for 70 years. And then they would go back and they would reestablish their temple and they would build the walls, they would establish their religion. And then now God is saying unto 2,300 years, that means that probably they were so sinful that God had decided he was going to extend the period of 70 years to 2,300 years. Daniel didn't understand this. So when Daniel chapter 9, which is the very next chapter, begins, you find Daniel is studying the prophecy, the 70-year prophecy. Why do you think he's studying the prophecy of the 70 years? Well, because he can't make sense that's between the 70 years and the 2,300 years. So he thinks the 70 years God is, because of their great sins, he's extending it for 2,300 years, and Daniel couldn't comprehend that. Then the text tells us that Daniel begins a prayer. He says, Lord, we have sinned. We are wicked. We deserve exactly what we got. We broke the covenant. But then when he gets to verse 19 of chapter 9, he says, but don't delay. Now that's an important word. He says to the God, don't delay in fulfilling the 70-year prophecy of the 70 years of captivity. God promised that after 70 years, he would take them back. And then we find that before his prayer could even end, Daniel comes from heaven and Gabriel comes back from heaven at the end of Daniel's prayer. And then he gives an explanation to Daniel of the 70 weeks from the going forth of the command to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. Quick summary, so we can understand this better. There's going to be a period of 70 weeks allotted to the Jewish nation, which is 490 years, right? The 490 years is the first part of the 2,300 day prophecy. Now, Daniel couldn't understand that. He thought it was an extension, right? And this gives us a starting point. So the 70 years begins with the going forth of the decree, right? So it gives us a starting point. So Daniel 9 related to the 2000, is Daniel 9 related to the 2,000-year prophecy? Yes, it is giving us a starting point because Gabriel couldn't explain it because Daniel got sick, right? And we know that, and it gives us an ending point because if you know when it starts, we can go 2,300 years and then we will come to the end, right? Simple as that. So this is the starting point of the prophecy given in Daniel chapter 8. So the prophecy vision was given in chapter 8. Daniel couldn't understand, and then the explanation is, the starting point is given in chapter 9. Then in Daniel chapter 10, we have an interesting battle. Now, this is very crucially important, right? How it's related to the 2,300 day prophecy, right? Now, in order for the 2,300 day prophecy to be fulfilled, was it necessary for Israel to go back to their land and rebuild their temple? Yes, of course. That was part of the prophecy, right? But for them to go back to their land to rebuild the temple, the Medo-Persian king had to give a decree, because it says from the going forth of the decree to build and restore the temple and Jerusalem, build the walls and restore Jerusalem, right? So we find in chapter 10, we find two individuals struggling with Cyrus, because Cyrus is the Medo-Persian king. One is called the Prince of Persia, and the other is Gabriel first, and then Michael steps in, and they're struggling with the Prince of Persia, who is Satan, right? What are they struggling about? They're struggling with the mind of Cyrus, for Cyrus to give the decree for God's people to go back and to rebuild the temple. And then ultimately the decrees would give them permission to establish the theocracy, so that the prophecy of the 70 weeks can begin on time. Okay? So do you think Satan knew this? Satan was able to interpret prophecy. He was able to interpret the prophecy of the 70 weeks and the 2,300 days. Now, do you suppose the devil rose, right? Brought in many counterfeit movements, like we find in 1844, right? Before the judgment hour message was given, we found that he brought in many movements. The Marxist evolution, the Baha'is, the Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons, spiritualism, you name it, one after the other, because the devil knew that God was going to raise up a true movement, and he wanted to confuse the minds of the people. Like he tried to confuse the mind of Cyrus so that he wouldn't give the decree, and the 2,300 days couldn't start at the right time. Okay? Right, let's move on. Now let's read a statement from Mrs. White in Prophets and Kings 571 and 572.
While Satan was striving to influence the highest powers in the kingdom of Medo-Persia to show disfavor to God's people, angels worked in behalf of the exiles. The controversy was one in which all heaven was interested. Through the prophet Daniel, we are given a glimpse of this mighty struggle between the forces of good and the forces of evil. For 3 weeks, Gabriel wrestled with the powers of darkness, seeking to counteract the influences at work on the mind of Cyrus. And before the contest closed, Christ himself came to Gabriel's aid.
So was the opposition, like we find in chapter 10, when they were going to rebuild the temple, did they have opposition? If you read Nehemiah, you will find out from that point all the way down to the building of the walls. Why? Because Satan knew that everything had to be restored in order for the 70 weeks to begin and the 2,300-day prophecy to begin. He knew that. So he tried his level best to stop it, to hinder it. So was Gabriel successful in fighting against the Prince of Persia and his host? Not by himself, right? So just imagine how powerful Satan is, right? Because Gabriel is a powerful angel. Because before the contest closed, we are told Christ himself came to Gabriel's aid so that the prophecy, the decree could go through. Did Cyrus give the decree? Yes. Well, which will ultimately lead to the decree of the 2,300 days. Now we notice that the central theme of Daniel 8 is the 2,300 days. What is the central theme of Daniel 9? The central theme of Daniel 9 is the beginning date of the 2,300 days or year prophecy. What is the central theme of Daniel 10? The central theme of Daniel 10 is the struggle for Israel to be re-established so that the 2,300 days can begin on time with the 70-week prophecy. Okay? Now, what about Daniel 10:1 to Daniel 12:3? Right now, we are going through the chapters of Daniel, right? Now, in chapter 11, Gabriel completes the explanation that he suspended in Daniel 8. right? Because Daniel got sick, he couldn't handle it, right? It is important to underline that there is no new vision in this chapter, right? Only an explanation of the vision given in chapter 8, right? This indicates that Daniel 11 is the explanation of the vision of Daniel 8, chapter 8, because there is no other vision in between chapters 8 and 11. 9 is an explanation giving us the date, right? The beginning of the 2,300 days. And then 10 is the struggle. So 11 is an explanation for chapter 8, right? So Gabriel begins the explanation of the vision of Daniel 8 at the same starting point. So Gabriel says, okay, Daniel, now I've explained the beginning date and the struggle so that the decree could be given. Now I'm going to take you back where I started Daniel 8, and we are going to go on the course of history. But instead of ending at 1844, I'm going to take you all the way to the close of probation and the setting up of the everlasting kingdom. So Gabriel in Daniel chapter 9 is going to take Daniel not up to the investigative judgment, but past that until the second coming, and the God's people are given the kingdom, right? So he's taking him further away from the investigative judgment that Daniel 8 was talking about. So in Daniel 8, the explanation of Daniel 11 begins during the kingdom of Persia rather than Babylon, okay? The explanation continues with Greece. Now, why is it with Medo-Persia? Because the decree was given for the beginning of the 70 weeks by the Medo-Persians during that time. Now, when this was written, there was about 11 years more left for Babylon. Babylon hadn't fallen. But it begins in Medo-Persia because the time of the decree began during the Medo-Persian time, right? So the explanation continues with Greece. Now, this is given by name, right? Alexander the Great, the first king, is referred to as the notable horn. Then the 4 divisions of Alexander's empire. The chapter then describes the dominion of the pagan Rome in verse 30. Papal Rome during the 1,260 years is next, found in verses 31 to 39. Then the deadly wound is then referred to in Daniel 11:40, the beginning part of it. It says the king of the south attacks the king of the north at the time of the end. That's the French Revolution. We have gone through that. The time of the end begins, as we see, in 1798 AD. So Daniel 11:40a is talking about that. Then the vision takes us beyond the 1,260 years of papal oppression to the final persecution against God's people when the king of the north's wound is healed. Now that is found in verses 40 to 45. Then, what about verse 44? Verse 44 says something very important, right? But news from the east and the north shall trouble him. Who is that? The papacy, right? The little horn. Therefore, he shall go out in great fury, right? This is talking about the king of the north, referring to the papacy. Therefore, he shall go out with great fury to destroy and annihilate many. So there's going to be news coming from the east and from the north that is going to trouble the king of the north, right? That's going to trouble the king of the north, who has overwhelmed everything. Now, what is this news? What is this news that troubles the king of the north, or the resurrected, the wound healed papacy? Who comes from the east? The angel that seals comes from the rising sun. The rising sun is in the east. And where is the north? North is where up, right? So northeast comes from. Revelation 18 speaks about that, about an angel that descends from heaven, and the whole world is filled with his glory. This is referring to the loud cry. Remember, Gabriel is taking Daniel past the investigative judgment into the time of far into the future. This is going to be this when the loud cry goes out, the latter rain falls, this is going to alarm the papacy. And what is he going to do? As a result, the king of the north or the papacy goes out to destroy and annihilate God's people and sets up a strategic point to deliver a final death blow. But when he goes out to annihilate many, what happens? We find that Daniel chapter 12 verse 1, Michael stands up to defend his people. Now, as we shall see, the standing up of Michael refers to the close of human probation, corporate and individual, okay, all of them. The end of the judgment that began in 1844. When Michael stands up, that is the end of the judgment. Everyone has been judged, the dead and the living. And when Jesus changes his garments from his high priestly garments to his garments of vengeance, he's coming to defend his people. So what does that mean? Michael stands up. It means that probation has closed corporately and individually. Now, the same expression stand up is used in verses 2 and 3 of 12 in reference to when a king begins to reign. Now, when will Jesus begin his reign? When his kingdom is made up. And when will his kingdom be made up? When the investigative judgment ends. Everybody who is going to be in his kingdom is revealed and their names are left in the book of life. Now, the vision of Daniel 8 only explains the prophetic chain from the kingdom of Persia 556 BC to the beginning of the judgment at the end of the 2300 days, which is 1844, right? That is the totality of the Daniel 8 vision. But the explanation of Daniel 11 begins at the same starting point of Daniel chapter 8 vision, but it takes us beyond the beginning of the judgment at the conclusion of the 2300 days to the close of the investigative judgment when Michael stands up. Now, if Daniel hadn't got sick when Daniel chapter 8, the explanation was being given, probably Gabriel would have given him everything in Daniel chapter 8, but he got sick. So Gabriel had to wait to explain things to Daniel. Now, what happens after Michael stands up? God's people will go through the worst time of trouble in earth's history, right? It's called the time of Jacob's trouble. When Michael stands up in heaven, probation closes, then there's a period of this great trouble on earth for God's people. But at the moment, at the time when it appears like the king of the north, the papacy is going to annihilate them, destroy them with a death decree, at the end of the time of trouble, God will deliver his people from the wrath of the king of the north. That is all those whose names have been retained in the book when their cases came up in the investigative judgment. Is that the end of the story? No. Gabriel is explaining more. Daniel 12:1. Let's read Daniel 12:1 and see what it's being said there.
While Satan was striving to at that time, Michael shall stand up, the great prince who stands watch over the sons of your people. And there shall be a time of trouble, such as never was since there was a nation, even to that time. And at that time, your people shall be delivered, everyone who is found written in the book.
Okay, now does that verse make sense to you? Notice not only does Gabriel take Daniel to when the wrath of the king of the north, of the papacy setting up a strategic place to deliver the death blow, the loud cry, the fourth angel, the sealing and the close of probation at the end of time, and the deliverance of God's people, but it goes beyond that, right? Then Daniel tells us in Revelation, Gabriel tells us in Daniel 12:2, talks about the special resurrection that takes place. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt. Those are the ones who pierced Jesus, right? They will resurrect in this special resurrection. And those who died in the faith of the third angel's message will resurrect during that period, right? So does it end there? Does it end? No. It ends with God's people shining as stars in an everlasting kingdom. Daniel chapter 12, verses 2 and 3. So that's Daniel chapter 11, 1 to Daniel chapter 12, 3. It takes us full cycle from the kingdom of Persia in 457 BC to the time when Jesus sets up his everlasting kingdom and his faithful followers are part of that kingdom. So does that make sense? That gives us good sense that the little book, what the little book of Daniel is about, right? Then the fifth reason, Daniel chapter 12, verse 4 tells us that the prophet sealed the little book about the 2,300 days and the judgment until the end of the, until the time of the end, time of the end. At the time of the end, therefore, we would expect the opening of this book, right? Because God said, seal it up to then obviously there has to be an opening, right? So is there any reference in scripture to the opening of the book in the time of the end? There most certainly is. If Daniel chapter 12, 4 says that the book is sealed until the time of the end, could we expect there to be some place in the Bible where it talks about the book being open? The book has to do with the judgment, and the judgment, our message, is going to cause a disappointment, but after that, it has to be preached, and that the temple has to be measured. Would we expect another place in the Bible to describe the moment when the book is open? Do we have such a passage in scripture? Where is it? It is found in Revelation chapter 10. A powerful angel descends from heaven with an open book in his hand, and the entire chapter of 10 has to do with the judgment. So next week, we will study about the opening of the little book that was sealed in Daniel 12:4. So I hope you understand what was sealed, and then next week we will study what the opening of that book.